Well, it is such a pleasure to be joined by two amazing musicians. We can't wait to welcome all of you to our first concert of the new year. Um, so, thank you so much to all of you tuning in for the King of Instruments concert that's coming up. We're being joined by our music director, Alain Trudel.
Hello.
I'm Merwin. I'm a violinist and artistic administrator, and our special guest is our soloist, Todd Wilson. Now, I would say welcome to Toledo, Todd, but I really don't have to do that for you, right?
You don't, honestly. No, I feel suitably connected with Toledo already. Yeah,
So there's a long history, I guess, that I mean, I've been here for almost 20 years and
right.
I've worked with you a number of times, but I found out that your history in Toledo certainly predates all of that.
Yeah. No, I was born in Toledo, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth and, the peristyle was a little bit newer than it is now. So, yeah, my connections there are lifelong for sure.
That's amazing. Now, I think it's always really interesting when we talk about the organ that there's really a very strong sense of history with an instrument. It really kind of becomes rooted to the venue that it's a part of,
Yeah.
and you can't really talk about the venue without talking about the instrument. Now, I think you might be the only person that we've had to play this Skinner organ who's actually played it prior to its renovation. So it was renovated in I think 2003, if I'm not mistaken, but
I remember it was early 2000s.
yeah,
Yes.
something like that. And so, could you talk about maybe your earlier history with that instrument?
Um, I remember hearing it, in those pre-renovation days, it wasn't used very often.
Mhm.
Um, in my growing up years, probably this would be junior high and high school. I was a regular attendee of the Toledo Symphony concerts, and I remember hearing the Poulenc organ concerto. The first time ever in my life that I heard that piece live was played on this same organ in the peristyle by a lady called Mary Cheney Nelson, who was the wife of Boris Nelson at that time, who was the longtime music critic at the
Mhm.
Toledo Blade and lovely guy. And Mary Nelson was a superb keyboardist, a very fine pianist, very fine organist. And she was the orchestra organ grinder. And she played the Poulenc concerto, and I can remember, where in the peristyle I was sitting. It made a very big impression on me. This wonderful piece that instantly, struck a chord with me, being a very big fan of French music in general. And that was the first time I ever heard the peristyle organ played, I believe. And I think the first time I ever heard organ and orchestra in combination. So it was, to say, all these years later, I still remember it vividly.
That's amazing. I think so. You actually got the chance to play the instrument as a high schooler, right?
Mhm.
Wow. So does that experience kind of when you come back to the instrument, like, is it kind of like visiting an old friend, or do you need to feel like you need to reacquaint yourself all over again?
You reacquaint, especially when it's a number of years in between. You get a little vague in your memories, but um, the nice thing now is that the organ works uh, well, and
Yeah.
from a mechanical standpoint, it's reliable. Whereas in those pre-renovation days, it was very dicey, and a lot of the stops didn't work, or maybe they work one day and they don't work the next day. So you couldn't depend on anything, and so that's the big dividing line in terms of how the instrument is to work with. You can make much more use of its tonal resources now, whereas before it was at best sort of a guessing game.
Well, in these kind of COVID-19 days, we're kind of heading into the first month of 2021. And because of that, we're centering the stringed instruments of the orchestra really throughout all of January. It's just
Right.
we're
Right.
able to be masking, masking up and so forth. But in a way, pairing organ and orchestra really is a natural fit for that, because the organ can really emulate so many of those woodwind and brass qualities. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe in general, but maybe tying it more particularly to the Skinner instrument and
Mhm.
what are the abilities of that instrument to emulate those woodwind and brass timbres.
Sure. Skinner, the organ builder Ernest M. Skinner was he was very proud of himself for his orchestral imitative organ stops, and
Mhm.
he developed a French horn, an English horn, and oboe, clarinet, all those sort of imitative sounds. On the Skinner organ, they are the best that they are on any pipe organs, probably in any country, really. I mean, that those were his strong points, and the organ in the peristyle has very lovely examples of all those things. So it's just as you say, it's the organ can fill in the blanks around the string section there, and it can
Yeah.
be to a certain extent the brass and the winds of
Mhm.
the tonal palette that are not there in terms of the orchestral side of things right now.
So in a way, when Alain, when we were talking about this program, we almost conceived of it like a gigantic organ symphony.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah,
four different composers, four different movements.
yeah.
But so, Alain, I know that you were kind of very much a proponent of this idea. Could you talk maybe about how we open this organ symphony with this amazing Poulenc concerto that Todd referenced earlier?
Yeah. Well, hello everybody. Hello Merwin, Todd. It's an honor to have you play with us with the symphony. It's
A great pleasure always. Yeah.
yeah. The idea is that first of all, we thought we'd like to feature. I mean, it's not called the King of the Instruments for nothing. It has all the instruments in the instrument, and it has different combinations that you can make that invent other instruments than the regular ones we see on stage. So the exchange between the strings, and let's not forget we're going to have timpani and harp in that concert as well. The mix with that, and timpani and harp is that little ingredient, the je ne sais quoi, that you have in your meal that you go like, oh, that was, oh wow, oh, so that's important to keep those. So each piece has something different. There's something just with the strings, there's something strings and organ, there's something with the timpani also, and another one with the harp. Of course, this program had to be centered around a major work. The French school of organ, like the French school of wind playing, I mean, it goes together. The music school of that is very important in the sense of a concerto work, the concertante work for organ. Of course, we have the older masters like Bach and Handel, but if we're looking for something that's kind of bit more, I wouldn't say romantic, but something that has this kind of a language that we want to also go a little bit further in what people know in their ear, and that's something that they know a little bit less, because people will know Bach. That's the reason why Bach is on that program, is that people know already what the organ sounds like in the toccata and fugue, let's say, and they already know, Handel, we know water music, so you have an idea how the organ concerto would sound. So we want to experiment a little bit. The big concerto, of course, there's a Guillemot concerto, there's Duruflé, there's music by Duruflé, there's a lot of French music that is wonderful. A lot of it is with big orchestra, and I find personally that it's nice. It gets sorry, it gets a little bit lost between the big orchestra and the big organ. It's like I wanted to have something that really had a definition. So the string orchestra, written by a master like Poulenc, and the organ really gets us going to know and understand the instrument and to have a real appreciation for it. So, and this is interesting. If I may say a few words about the Poulenc, if that's all right. What's interesting about it is the history behind it, because Poulenc, of course, was commissioned by this what's her name, Princesse Egmont de Polignac.
Polignac.
Yeah, now people might know her because Ravel Pavane, because she commissioned that too. She also commissioned that Kurt Weill a symphony, I think it's second, and she commissioned a lot of work. She was a real patron for the arts, and she liked, of course, Poulenc, and she wanted to commission something from him that she could play. So he started, he said, okay, I'm going to do and she could play at home, meaning a really huge place with kind of an organ, but more of a chamber organ. So Poulenc said, okay, I'm gonna start on this. And it didn't go anywhere because, well, it went somewhere, but it went into a concerto for harpsichord and then a concerto for two pianos.
Right.
And then, and then the idea completely went away because the organ part they wanted to write was kind of a tribute also to all the great organ music. It was way too difficult for amateur, even a very good amateur, to play. So the idea just went away. And then, and you have to think about it, between 1938, the tension in Europe, and Poulenc decided, for some reason, he has an epiphany, and he says, I'm going to go on the pèlerinage and to find my faith. You know, all of a sudden in 36, 38, just as the Nazis are coming over in Europe, not in France yet, but, you know, very close. And the tension in Europe is like this. And he has this very inner moment that he has, a lot of artists have. And that's very important to have the arts to remember those times also, because the arts makes us remember how we feel personally about events that are outside of our control a little bit. Now, because the way we perceive life sometimes is different than the absolute, like the exact event that's going on. It might trigger into us different things, all of us, all different things. So Poulenc, it was like he went there, and that was the beginning of his sacred music. Now, the beginning of his sacred music starts with an organ concerto that is anything but sacred. I mean, it's very virtuosic and has a lot of color. I wouldn't say anything but sacred, but, you know, it got him to go back to that. So he wrote it, and Poulenc had, correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, but I don't think Poulenc had written anything for organ before that. That was like his first piece for organ is his concerto.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you have to imagine how hard he worked. And we think that those composers, the geniuses, they just put a piece of paper and they write it. No, they have to go and study. It's like studying for a role, you know. You go on a ride along, you know. Mm-hmm. So you went on a ride along with Bach and with Handel and Buxtehude. Let's not forget Buxtehude, very important organist. And of course, I'm a trombone player. I know all of those people because we had lots of repertoire from them. And I love the organ. I mean, this is an instrument that has a natural affinity with mine. But anyway, that's something else. And he went on this pèlerinage. How do you say pèlerinage in English?
A pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Pilgrimage, Wagner. Yeah. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Okay. So not to be connected with what we're talking about. Okay. So he went on this pilgrimage, but for his faith, but also it's kind of a pilgrimage to learn about this wonderful new world in front of him, musical world that will have organ, that will have more choir, more religious music. So that organ concerto comes from, you have to think, a commission from a salon music, that something that somebody that's hoping for something lightish, you know, that becomes piano piece, that becomes a harpsichord piece that goes along, that goes into a pilgrimage, and that finally becomes the gateway to this period of Poulenc where it's more religious a little bit, and this organ concerto is the key to that.
So, Alain, you mentioned how this was a piece that had a lot of kind of a personal connection. And then Todd, you mentioned that you saw this piece. This was the first time you'd ever seen the organ with orchestra. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe kind of, in your own personal journey, I guess, what role does the Poulenc Concerto play in that? Like, it's something that came into your life very early. How does it kind of impact your life?
It's a piece that I've had the good fortune to play and conduct on a fairly regular basis, more than any other organ and orchestra piece for me personally. And it's a piece that I absolutely adore. If I heard that piece every day of my life, I don't think I would ever get tired of it, honestly. And to me, it's a perfect piece. It's, you know, just as Alain was saying, Poulenc at his very best is such a wonderful composer. And I mean, in all these years of living with this piece, there's not a note that I would change, honestly. I just, if I'd written that piece, I would feel really, really good about it. You know, it's just, it has contrast, it has all these varieties of moods, it uses the organ to its best strengths. The combination of the organ with the strings and the timpani It's sonically, it's just an ideal partnership, and he gauges everything so perfectly and so beautifully. The harmonies, the melodies, and the build-ups, the tension, relaxation, all those elements are just in ideal proportion in this only, 17, 18-minute piece. It's not a very long piece, but there is so much there, and it's so wonderful, every bit of it. So, I've always loved this piece, and I look forward to having another go at it, especially with such a wonderful orchestra and in such a lovely hall.
Wonderful. It's so amazing to move from this very kind of piece of core repertoire, something that's so central to the organ and orchestra repertoire, in our kind of our pseudo symphony. The second movement of this symphony, it's a comparative rarity. This is actually a piece, though it does not involve the organ, it for some reason feels very much like an organ piece to me. It's written by Anton Bruckner, and it's an intermezzo for strings. And I mean, this might be this might not be a fully considered statement, but when I'm thinking of all the great symphonists, to me, Bruckner writes for the orchestra as if we were stops on an organ. And so, Alain, when you were proposing this Bruckner intermezzo, how does that fit within this all of these wonderful pieces for organ and orchestra? How do you envision the Bruckner fitting in?
Well, if you think of composers that were organists, I mean, there's Bach, of course, where Bruckner is right up there with some of the greatest, especially for orchestra, the greatest composers that ever wrote, that was an organist. And as you said, it's true that sometimes, and I see it that way when we play a Bruckner symphony, like the brass is not a brass that's pointy or anything like that. It's like a very organ in the sense of organic as well. Yeah. It's like there's I know this is only, we're playing with words here, but it's true. And it's like that. And I thought it would be great to have something by Bruckner on this program. Now, what are we going to play from Bruckner? That was the other question, because you don't want to take apart a work that's already there. You just, it's a symphony concert. You don't want to just do it's not a light classic where you can do a mix and match, but there's this movement, because this movement originally was this intermezzo was replaced. Now people play the 5 movements, but the quartet originally, he had written the intermezzo, he took it out and he put a scherzo in it, right? So this was a work that became a work of its own, and I thought that would be a great. I've played it, believe it or not, as a brass piece, like I played the Adagio from the string quintet, also as a brass and organ piece. But and I thought, you know what? If I add a bass part to it, make it an orchestra piece. So that's what we did. I put a bass part to it, and then we're going to do the symphony with the strings. Now, I thought it would be great to have one piece in the program without the organ, but music written by an organist. So we keep the link going. So that's how, and that's why this piece is there.
And then so often in a symphony, this third movement will be this unusually reflective, slower movement. And in this case, we have what's very popularly known as the Albinoni Adagio. Now, this is, it's maybe somewhat controversially known as the Albinoni Adagio, but it is definitely the way that, music lovers know the piece. Maybe, Todd, would you mind maybe explaining a little bit about why that name might be a little bit controversial, and how maybe where you stand on how it should be called and how it should be titled?
Yeah, it's the Albinoni Adagio has I don't know why it's taken on this sort of iconic identity, and as you say, very famous piece, not quite in the same file folder as the Pachelbel canon, but sort of headed in that direction, like it's it's one of those pieces a lot of people have heard, whether you know it or not. You probably heard it, and it's pretty simple in its nature. I don't know. I don't know this. I'm sure there's probably more backstory than I'm familiar with in terms of how this single movement became so well known. I don't quite understand how that has happened, but it is certainly a fact. The organ just is really a continuo instrument, in this piece. The strings have the main melodic content, which is very beautiful. I think it came from a is it an oboe concerto? What is it from originally?
Well, I think it's actually really interesting. There was I think a musicologist named Rema Giazzotto who found who claims to have found a fragment that it might not have been from a noble concerto. It's only about a 6 or 7 bar fragment that really is that kind of the organ fragment at the beginning.
Really?
And then he interpolated all of these string parts on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the controversy is that it may or may not actually have been by Albinoni at all.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that as a violinist, I think of all those pieces by Fritz Kreisler, and he's like, oh, I wanted to write a piece in this style. Let me choose this composer, and it'll be by Pugnani, or it will be by, or and but there are definitely people who very much believe this is Albinoni's, core inspiration, and then Giazzotto just touched a bit on the edges, and I don't think we'll ever really know, unfortunately. But it's a gorgeous piece of music, though it is a little bit there's a lot of wonderful concertmaster solos and so on and so forth for it as well. A piece that's certainly more organ forefronted is the final work on our program. It's by Hansen, Howard Hansen, the concerto with the organ and harp and strings. This actually, it's just one of the versions that Howard Hansen wrote. Have you played the other versions?
No, I've never played. I don't think I've even heard. It was a much earlier version, something like 20 years before, that was for organ with big orchestra. And it didn't get performed very often because of the usual reasons for, either space or budget or programming time or whatever. So people were always after Hansen to make a smaller orchestra version of it. And he finally did what we have as the strings and harp. And it works really well. It's another piece I've had the chance to play on and off over a number of years, and I always enjoy it. It's typical Hansen, very romantic, very beautiful, a lot of different ideas that he puts into the pot, because I think even the first version, if I remember right, drew on some earlier works that he
it was actually a symphonic poem.
A symphonic. It's called North and West.
It's I think called North and West.
Right.
So there's a lot of themes that are clashing.
There's a lot of tastes in this stew. But it hangs together somehow quite well, and one thing leads to the next in a pretty logical way. And like the Poulenc, it uses the orchestra and the organ both to great effect. Sometimes the organ is part of the orchestral palette, and the organ other times has some really soloistic, typical concerto moments. Like there's a cadenza for the feet only, for the pedals, which is a typical organ concerto trick, but nonetheless very effective. And some of the melodic stuff in that piece is very beautiful. It's really lovely.
Well, Alain, it's funny, we've just kind of subconsciously, maybe it's because it's close to lunchtime, we've used palettes, stews, we talked, and you talked, Alain, about this je ne sais quoi that you're adding to different dishes. What does the harp add maybe to this particular texture? This organ and harp piece, we've had an organ and timpani piece. What do you think of how the harp kind of lends itself to the Hansen? And Todd, if you want to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, sure. For me, the harp, it articulates the language a little bit more, because the strings can articulate as well, but we have this round sound. The timpani has relativity with the pedals and with the lower register, but the harp in this one, it has a little bit more like it's like an accent on the letter, like any with an accent, like an A or a A, and it really articulates a little bit more. Of course, it brings even more romance into this very romantic work, and the balance between the Poulenc the Poulenc is really a concertante work, and the Hansen is a very collaborative work, actually. As Todd said, sometimes the organ is part of the orchestra, and sometimes it's very, of course, virtuosic with the cadenza, as you mentioned. But I think in this concert, like this is our finale, you were comparing this to a symphony.
Yeah.
This is our big finale. And I think it was important to bring everybody together, but also to have a little bit of a way to wrap up this idea of featuring the King of Instruments.
Yeah.
So we're actually going to be performing this with a returning guest conductor, James Fedek, who himself is an organist. So you'd mentioned, Todd, that you have done quite a bit of conducting as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I will imagine that like it must be somewhat rarer to work with a conductor who's also an organist.
True, yeah.
So so first I'm going to pose the question to Alain. When you're working with other trombonists, how does that feel? Is that is it especially different than working with other soloists? Is it hard for you to kind of say, I'll take away the way I would do this and subjugate that to the way the soloist would, and then I'll pose a similar question to Todd.
It's actually a great question because it also factors into orchestra conducting.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you have, at the National Arts Center in Ottawa, they used to have Pinkas Zuckerman, and you get a whole bunch of nervous violins in there to start. So for me, the first month that even when I started in Toledo, where all the brass were going like, okay, this guy knows what we're doing. So there's a little bit of that. And the fact that I have a career as a player as well. So for them, they can listen to the records and all that. So it's a little bit like, I have to say, conducting brass soloists, not trombone, but brass. I mean, trombone, yes, but all the brass soloists, it can be very, very helpful, but it's kind of jagged edge for a brass player because, well, for us is that, you get dry lips, you get a little nervous. That doesn't really help, but I do breathe with them. Like you can breathe with the singers. I mean, I conduct singers also a lot. And I had a lot of singing coaching when I was younger, and I didn't want to be a singer, but I had all the coachings that go with it. So you breathe like that. It's the same as I had to spend a good 10, 15 years learning how to conduct strings better when I was a baby conductor. and that was important. But it's important, I think, in the sense, especially with the organ, and it has, I don't know, Todd, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a sense of time and space that needs to be respected. Like if you conduct singers, mm-hmm. they breathe, but in the organ, you have to move, you have to change your different things. You have to do the different pedals. So if you're an organist, it's I think it's a really a plus because you have a feeling of what the movements are. So I have the feeling of what the movements are and how much a break for me they need to take away from the mouthpiece, come back and play. It's probably the same with the organ.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as you say, every instrument brings with it its particular characteristics of performing and things that you have to naturally keep in mind. And I'm very interested to hear you say of so many years of being a better string conductor. I feel like that has been my lifelong challenge as a conductor. If I could do one thing differently, I would play a string instrument.
I signed up for about 8 years in the Toronto Symphony Youth Orchestra to be their conductor just for that.
Yeah,
I did that for 8 years and bowing all my parts and trial and error and having my colleagues helping me. It's conducting is as you know, is not exactly what some people think. It's a work of humility, and you work at the pleasure of the orchestra. You need to make the orchestra sound good. Yep. It's not about looking good; it's about sounding good. Yeah. So and that's a lifetime of craftsmanship.
Yeah, for sure, never ends. But
yeah,
there have been certainly a number of very well-known conductors who began as organists, and as you say, it's not the worst background that you can bring to conducting. I think that sense of time and space across an orchestra relates very closely to how a pipe organ works as well.
Exactly.
It's a useful background, and for the organ, very often the pipes are some distance removed from the keyboard. So the whole business of rhythm and timing and adjustments for the space that you're in is a very big part of organ playing, just as it is part of guiding an orchestra and dealing with different halls and different stage arrangements and sound qualities. So yeah, it'll be fun to. I've known James for a long time. I first met him when he was an organ student at Oberlin years ago.
Wow.
But I have never worked with him as a conductor. I've seen him conduct actually in the same way. He did the Cleveland Orchestra Youth Orchestra for a number of years in his growing up here. And
You have to.
but I've never had the privilege of working with him on the stage. So I really look forward to this.
I never really thought about it in this sense, but when you're talking especially about a setup like the Peristyle Skinner organ, where you've got a movable console and the pipes literally span the entire width of the stage, in a way, you've been dealing with all of like a socially distanced method of sound production much more than any of us string players have been.
That's true. I mean, the organ, for better or for worse, is not always a good thing, but the organ can be a pretty successful socially distanced instrument.
Wow. So this, though a timeless concert, very much a concert of this time. So we are so excited to be able to present this concert of Poulenc, Bruckner, Albinoni / Giotto, and Hansen to you. We're so excited to welcome back Todd Wilson to Toledo. And I'm sure Alain sends his best wishes from north of the border. And Happy New Year to all of us. And to all of you who have gotten the chance to tune in, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you virtually or in person soon.